Live. Okay, going live. So today, what we're going to do is what we discussed doing yesterday, which is on December 25th of last year, so about a month ago, Jordan Peterson had another conversation with Sam Harris, and it's all about ethics. Jordan's looking for common ground. It seems it's mostly really an interview of Sam. I would say there's more energy in that direction than in some of the previous ones. And we know that Sam is really concerned with having, so some people would say an objective morals, but something like a solid ethic that's grounded in something. And Jordan Peterson picked that out as part of the motivation of his books. And so they've been talking about it for a long time, and probably people here have seen some of these, but this one's going to fit along really well with what we've been talking about. So without further ado.
I'm pleased to announce my new tour for 2024. Beginning in early February and running through June, Tammy and I and an assortment of special guests are going to visit 51.
So the moral confusion here is that you have...
Bye-bye.
So the moral confusion here is that you have many well-educated people who will make very fine-grained distinctions about moral norms in the context of living in 21st century America. They'll consider words to be violence, and the misgendering of people to be a profound microaggression. But you ask them to consider whether someone like Malala Yousafzai was badly treated by the Taliban, and they become tongue-tied.
Hello, everyone. Today, I have the opportunity to talk to Sam Harris once again. Sam and I have spoken many times, and usually publicly in the past, trying to sort out our mutual understanding in relationship to such topics as, well, morality, fundamentally. Both Sam and I are convinced to the core of our beings, you might say, that there is a true and not merely relative distinction between good and evil, although we differ to some degree in how that distinction might be characterized and what the fact of that distinction means with regard to belief. And so every time I talk to Sam, I'm interested in trying to understand, for example, what he really means by objecting to the religious propositions that he does object to as one of the horsemen of the new atheist movement, so-called, especially given that Sam is also committed to what you might describe as a religious practice. He's an avid meditator and certainly believes that spiritual experience is not only real, but perhaps the most real form of experience that's available to us. So we're going to hash through that again, to try to distinguish between dogma and knowledge, to try to distinguish between religious experience per se, or the religious experience that's valuable, and a counterproductive totalitarian dogmatism, and to try to lay that all out with forays into the domains of, well, meditative practice and with the occasional description and discussion of the political. So it's good to see you again, Sam. And
yeah, Jordan.
I think the first thing that I will ask you about is, I'm just curious, we haven't talked for, I think it's almost a year now. I believe that's the case. And so the first thing I'm curious about is, what are you up to?
It feels like 2 years. I feel like our last conversation was in the very depths of COVID, and I was in some basement lair. So I have it's got to be 2 years. Things are great. I mean, it's really a nice time of life. It's nice with the family. It's nice professionally. It's just I'm in a good spot. It's I'm all too aware that things can change. So I'm enjoying my moment in the sun, but it's really a beautiful period of life.
Yeah. So what's good?
I mean, my in terms of just how I spend my time day to day, it really has become a semi-seamless machine for producing well-being. I mean, it's really, I'm doing what I want to do moment to moment, and finding lots of people who want me to do it. So it's just there's not much distance between what I have to do, certainly professionally, and what I would do anyway, just because I want to do it. So it's I count myself as extraordinarily lucky to have found my my path here, and that it's working. So it's yeah. I mean, I have no complaints. It would be indecent to complain about anything personally at this point, except for the passage of time and the implications of that, which I know all too well.
Yeah, well, I would say that you look both younger and happier than you did the last time I saw you. And, I got quite attuned in my clinical practice to watching people's faces, obviously, but also seeing to some degree the way that they're set habitually, and you look very good. And so I'm very happy to hear it. You said something I think that is of particular interest to me, is that you have managed, and also attribute this to some degree to good fortune, to bring together what you have to do with what you would want to do. And that seems to me a sign of optimality of function, as well as the good fortune that we just described. And so what is it that you think that you're doing that's enabled you? I mean, I know that you've been concentrating to a large degree on meditative practice, for example, but what is it that you think you've done to your attitude, let's say, to your patterns of attention, that have enabled you to bring what you need to do and what you want to do in alignment?
Well, I mean, this has been happening for quite some time. I would say that this has been, it's taken me 20 years to fully get my professional life and my core interests to gel. And so part of that is having built out platforms where I can just follow my interests and follow the needs of the moment, whether it's responding to something that's in the news, or just figuring out what I'm most want to pay attention to in a given day or week. So, I mean, as you know, I have both my podcast, Making Sense, and I have the app, Waking Up, which is, it started at narrowly focused as a meditation app, but it's much more of an applied philosophy app at this point. It's just expanded beyond meditation, and it's expanded well beyond my contributions to it. So it's there are many other people on it, and so I can bounce between those two platforms, however I see fit. And they're while superficially they're similar, because they're just me pushing MP3 files out to the world. They're just audio platforms in the end. They're totally unlike one another with respect to the kinds of topics I tend to engage and the kinds of interactions with the world that provokes. So it's really it's almost like I'm living two lives simultaneously, because I'm Waking Up, the app, I get, it's no exaggeration to say it. It's almost uniformly just pure positivity coming back at me. Apart from the occasional software glitch that crashes somebody's phone, and we hear about that. It's just that there's no distance between what I'm intending to put out and the effect I'm hoping to have, and the effect that I in fact seem to be having based on the feedback. So, this was, this has been, it was launched almost exactly 5 years ago. So for 5 years, I've had this look at this kind of alternate life. It's almost like a counterfactual life to the one I hadn't managed to lead, where I could sidestep all pointless controversy and annoying, bad faith criticisms, and just meet people at a place where what I have to give is found valuable by them in precisely the way that I would hope, right? So it's like a purely positive encounter with legions of people, which, again, because of my experience as an author and as a podcaster, I had lost sight of that even being a possibility, right? I had lost sight of the fact that there are people in this world who have careers where they don't get any grief from the world, because the world just understands what they're putting out, and people like it, and they get paid for it, and it's a transaction that makes everybody happy. And So it's like opening a bakery where everyone loves the scones, and there's just nothing bad about it. And yet I find that, and this, I'm sure you feel the same way. I can't stay merely in that lane because there are other topics of social importance that I feel a need to comment on. And so I have my podcast and public speaking or books or any other channel by which to do that. And mostly I'm doing my podcast for that. But so I still have a foot in the water of controversy. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those controversies here. But it's to have both is such a source of sanity, because I can just swim in whatever waters I want to swim in on a daily basis. So it's quite wonderful.
So why do you, just out of curiosity, so while there's a substantial parallel, I would say, between the situation you're in and the situation that I'm in, given what you just described, because one of the reasons that I continue to tour continually, essentially, is because it's completely positive. And I engage in almost no political discussion, almost no culture war discussion. Almost all of it is, well, you talk about your waking up system. And I suppose I'm walking on a parallel line insofar as I'm encouraging people to aim up. And I don't know if there's any difference between waking up and aiming up. Perhaps there is, and we can talk about that. But it is a great relief to be in a domain that's entirely positive. And then it is interleaved for me, as it is for you, with some degree of combat, let's say, on the more philosophical and culture war side of things. Why have you concluded? Sometimes I wonder, Sam, if it wouldn't be just as well to stay in the positive domain all the time. And I know that you are no longer on Twitter, for example, and so that's obviously one of the places where you've detached yourself from the proliferation of, you might say, unnecessary and polarizing conflict. But you just did indicate that you feel either a moral obligation or an intellectual pull towards keeping abreast of the domain of life that constitutes more problems. And so why do you think that balance is necessary? Why don't you forego that entirely and stay within the domain of the positive? I mean, you seem to have concluded that balancing them is actually better for you in some sense, or maybe better in general. So why did you conclude that?
Yeah, well, it's a question I continue to ask myself because, you only have one life, or I would say you only have one life you can be sure of. And so why not live it in the happiest manner possible? But I do find that there are certain moments. First of all, my interests are wider than can be encompassed just by things like meditation and narrowly focusing on questions about how to live the most meaningful possible life. Right? It's not all just about maximizing mental pleasure or even one's ethical wisdom moment to moment. There's things that interest me that I want to talk about that really don't belong over at Waking Up, but they do belong on my podcast. So talking about physics, say, right? That's just interesting, and I like to do that. So there's that. As you say, I deleted my Twitter account, which is an important part of the answer to your first question of just what has gotten better for me in the last 12 months. That was, I really am embarrassed to say what a life hack that turned out to be, to get off Twitter. We can talk about why I did if you want, but the net result has been almost unambiguously positive. I mean, there's a slight sense, certainly when the things in the news are really heating up, that I could be missing something, or I'm not party to the conversation that's happening at that kind of interval, where people are responding to things every 30 seconds. But the truth is, I don't have to be, because what I have found is that when you don't have an opportunity to just blurt out your instantaneous response to something that's happening in the news or something you saw in your timeline, and you have to let your response to it cure over the course of days, in my case, because I have to decide okay, is this important enough for me to actually talk about it on my podcast? And I might not be, podcasting again for another 3 days or even a week. And so many things don't survive that test. They just 98% of things just fall by the wayside, because the truth is you didn't have to broadcast your opinion about that thing that happened on that campus, by that indiscretion committed by that stupid blue-haired person, right? So it's just like you didn't have to weigh in, and you didn't have to reap all of the attendant poison of having weighed in, and you didn't have to worry about whether you should respond to that poison and those misunderstandings generated there. And I noticed in retrospect that, and I dimly knew this when I was on Twitter, but I didn't fully appreciate it until I was off, that it was no exaggeration to say that basically every bad thing in my life, apart from the sickness of the people close to me, was a result of something I had done on Twitter, or something that I had seen on Twitter.
I can relate to that
I felt I needed to respond to. So it was just this kind of hallucination machine that I had invited into the center of my life, and getting rid of it really modified my sense of not just what I have to do on a day-to-day basis and what I should do, but just of my own existence, right? Like, there was something about my digital existence that was claiming too much real estate in my conception of myself as a person, right? And
you might have put your finger on it, at least to some degree, there with something like your observation about whether or not you're willing to put time into it. I've had many discussions with my family about Twitter in particular, and I would tend to agree with you that much of the negativity that I do run into in my life is a consequence of Twitter. And so now I use Twitter to stay abreast of the sorts of things that you described that you might be able to get access to on Twitter as well, current events. And there is that temptation to respond immediately. But you intimated that maybe a good rule of thumb is something like, if you're not willing to sit down and think about it for an hour, let's say, then perhaps it's not important enough to share your opinion with millions of people and reap the consequences. And Twitter is, although it's a social media platform that facilitates impulsivity, it's also a broad-scale publishing platform, and it's not obvious that you should be publishing all your instantaneous responses to cultural events. And it's a funny thing for me, because it's not that easy to dissociate that from responsibility. I feel that I have a responsibility to bring to light, let's say, certain elements of the culture war that are going on at a deep level. And part of the reason that I use Twitter the way that I do use it is...
So I never thought of this in context of Twitter, although I should have. But there's a couple of ideas that I've heard from public intellectuals and academics that I respect, that about the life of a thoughtful life. And one of them that I always crack a smile at, that I like, is you should definitely have unpublished thoughts. Now, with Twitter, what he's pointing out is that you can have everything published the moment you think it, which is, of course, an even worse problem. But there's something desirable, I think, of even having well thought out opinions that don't have to be subject to the mill of approval and disapproval or something like that. I remember Nietzsche spoke about, he's so ridiculous, I love it. He said, the fact that anybody can learn to read pollutes not only writing but also thinking. What it means is that if you knew that only the 25 most genius people on the planet knew how to read, and you were one of you learned how to write in that context, you'd be writing to that audience, right? So you'd be very careful about what you were saying, because they were very smart people, and so you'd really think hard about your position. But if you look at the average idiocy on Twitter, that social ingrained check within you has now been polluted because people on Twitter are stupider than people in everyday life, right? There's no consequences, there's no physical consequences. So now what you're doing is you're catering your message, and therefore, Nietzsche says, also your thinking process is being manipulated by that algorithm of this is the audience I have to speak with. So what will get a big effect there? Oh, if I say something outrageous, I could probably get a lot of attention, and then that gives me a, you know how it is, the positive dopamine reward from the constant feedback loop and everything. But Nietzsche noticed it before the internet. If you were living in a community of people who, you know, cheered at stupidity, your thinking itself would become polluted, just because we're social creatures. Anyway, didn't mean to get into too much of a tangent, but I should have queued this up earlier so that we got right to the ethics part. But I've checked on another tab and it's coming up soon, so I'm just going to let it play out because it's actually kind of nice to see the human side of things first before we get into the debate. Anyway, I thought I'd throw that out there. So it was, you should have unpublished opinions, unpublished thoughts, and there were a few other I thought of. But in any case, let's move
do
back
that,
into
but
this.
then it does have that problem of intense negativity. And I learned from walking through airports with my wife, we had this discussion a couple of times. Airports have bothered me a lot ever since 9/11. I review them as they're like for me, they're the bleeding edge of the totalitarian incursion into general day-to-day life. And they've always made me very uncomfortable. I don't like lining up for the for the screenings, the theatrical screenings and so forth. And
one might suggest to him at this moment that there's also a reason why he left academia if he's looking for the pointed edge of the spear of the communist dystopia, but I'm sure he already knows that. Who here has been uncomfortable in airports since 9/11? I totally share that feeling with him. It's annoying, it's horrible, I don't like it. It's exactly what he's describing. It's like getting in a time machine or an airplane to go to a country that is well, I've been in countries where when you walk through the airport, there's people with automatic weapons standing on pedestals as you're walking by and everything. Those somehow that's not as bad, right? In our airports, the guys with the automatic weapons are just behind a glass door that becomes opaque when they turn a switch or whatever. It's kind of, it would be nicer if it was more explicit than hidden, I suppose. But I know there's some conspiracy theories out there that the fourth plane on 9/11 was shot down by us, and I think that makes sense. I haven't looked into it. But before I considered that as a possibility, it occurred to me. So the story was, hey, people with cell phones on the fourth plane heard what was happening from their relatives, and they decided that they were going to storm the cockpit and ditch the plane rather than let it be flown into the Capitol building or the White House or wherever it was headed. I think that's probably the case. And if it's the case, what it means is that an hour and 57 minutes after the attack on 9/11 started, we no longer needed any adjustments to the airplane system, to the airports. Because up till then, people had been told, hey, if your plane gets hijacked, stay quiet, don't draw attention to yourself, it'll land, they'll demand some prisoner gets released, and this is the way we keep hostages alive. We weren't living in a world where people would suicide fly the plane into a building. But it only took us about an hour to be educated, so nobody could do that again. It's not like that type of an attack could happen again just a few hours after 9/11. The fourth one failed. So it makes it all the worse that they do as much as they do to track everybody. Anyway, we don't have to talk about that more, but
that made me very.
I was just curious. Other people feel the same way about airports post 9/11, right? Like,
I think it's more on the illusion of security than the actual security.
Right. It wasn't needed, and you didn't do anything to help on top of it. Yeah, absolutely. That's like all totalitarian systems. There's 18 ironic things to complain about, and any one of them would be enough to abolish the damn thing. Yeah, it's a security theater, right? As they call it. Damn
Yeah,
it.
they've had it where they've gone through and they've looked at items that have gotten through and they've missed a bunch of stuff, and it's right. It's more theater than anything else.
I
Unfortunately.
haven't, yeah, I haven't thought this out yet, but so Orwell talked about sort of the smell of totalitarianism. Like there's a feel when you're around it. I don't think it's accidental that the TSA employees are exactly the sort of people that you would think this is a person who was waiting for the government to give them a job. You know what I mean? Like it's security theater, but it's obviously going to be catering to the most incompetent and easy to manipulate and people with a grudge against the rest of society anyway. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed, but TSA employees, they don't seem like police officers. They don't seem like your local sheriff. They don't seem like people who are dedicated to the cause of protecting things. They're it's added insult to the injury.
Yeah, I mean they're just order takers. They don't know any different. I was gonna make another comment. I'll see if
No, go ahead.
no. Well, it slipped my mind. So
Oh, okay. It'll come back. So have you what was it? I just lost mine. You hypnotized me into losing my point. It's contagious. The types of people that do these jobs. Oh, did you know? So I left New York because here's something worth noticing. What percentage of our neighbors can't wait for a government takeover of everything? Well, I lived in New York and it was upstate New York. And the number of people who were thrilled to death to immediately swallow whatever propaganda told them they got to tell people they can't go places in public without a mask. And I mean, it was nasty. It was like I remember I walked into a gas station because my card, like it wouldn't accept my card at the machine. I don't know if that had to do with the COVID thing. I walked in and I gave some cash to the gentleman who was working there, and I didn't wear a mask. And he just looked at me and I walked out. I was like, all right, well, he has the money. He didn't put it in the machine. He wouldn't. I already walked out of the tiny little building. He was a young kid. It's not like he was going to die of the flu. I didn't have it. He threw my money on the ground. He forced me to walk back in without a mask again just to get my money and then drive off to another gas station. It's like there's this added like sadomasochistic pleasure or sadistic pleasure. And the percentage of our neighbors who can't wait to get a job in the TSA or something like that, or in the bloated university system, which is destroying, I mean, it's just crumbling in front of people right now. It's 9/10 of the professors and all of the administrative jobs that didn't exist 5 years ago with the words, inclusion in the title and feelings in the title of their jobs. They're explicitly destroying the universities, but they should be given 2 weeks to find honest work. They've been waiting for the chance for a power system to dub them the important ones who will not only obey but will force others to obey. And I think it's important to notice that totalitarianism in every generation, there's a grassroots movement for it. Like the number of people who want liberty is small. It's a thin minority. We kick ass compared to the majority of want to be slaves. But thinking for yourself and taking responsibility for your life is painful. And if somebody else will come in and tell you, "Hey, this is how it is. There's a system and there's rules for a reason." I remember I've done this a few times. I hate when people tell me that the reason why they can't treat me like a human being or be decent is that it's the policy. I'm supposed to hear that and then immediately just go along with some nonsense. So I've taken to carrying around a piece of paper that has written on it Stephen's policy. And it says, it's my policy not to take it's a policy as an excuse for anything. But the sorts of people I'm talking about, they don't find that joke funny. in any case, I think we win in the end. So let's just keep pushing. And did you?
Yeah, the other problem with that you look at TSA is that's not something that's going to be pulled back, right? That isn't.
That's
not something that's going to be pulled back. There's funding that's required for it, right? So now
huge.
It's just,
you create an entire industry out of nothing. Yeah, there's no one.
The budget.
It can collapse, but it can't be pulled back. And that's how power systems work. They encroach, but they never back down. As soon as everybody said 15 days to slow the curve, the second I heard that phrase, I said, this is the rest of your life. Every year that they want, because it's an election year and they want to make people afraid, all they have to do is ask a scientist, hey, have you discovered a new strain of COVID this year? Which, of course, we've had 8 COVIDs before this one, and there's always one. And then they can publish their article, oh, scientists have identified a new strain of COVID this year, and some of them are worried that it might be deadlier than the last one. And then you'll have the conversation on NPR. Should we or should we not preempt it by start wearing masks? And it's like, this is the rest of your life. If you give up an inch, they take it. And the only way back is either revolution or they collapse just under their own weight of stupidity, which I think is coming. It's what's happening to the universities. But yeah, you're right. That's an important point. It's not like it ever goes backwards, because for the same reason you said, there's money involved. It's like, this is another excuse for us to take tax money and put it somewhere that nobody would ever in their right mind choose to put it. And so we've got all the people we're hiring. They're going to definitely vote for us, and they're going to totally repeat the talking points of yelling at their neighbors if they don't vote with us. It's just, we need to understand the nature of the beast if we're going to push back against it. Government is a necessary evil, but it needs restriction. And if people don't want liberty, they're going to just give it up. And we've been giving it up for way too damn long. I should probably stop making little speeches. Any other points? Let's continue. All right. I promise this is going to get into ethics really soon.
Bitchy and hard to get along with in airports.
Bitchy.
And, I had a conversation with my wife, a fairly detailed conversation. And our decision was, if I'm in an airport and something happens that annoys me, but isn't important enough to actually sit down and write about, then I have to just ignore it or shut up about it. And this has also helped me calibrate my responses. And it's the same problem with Twitter, right? Is that something can be irritating and be genuinely irritating, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the most appropriate way to deal with it is to share your irritation in the moment.
People talk about pick the hill you want to die on. First of all, if you're actually being irritated and you can't do it with humor and grace, then maybe that's a really good rule. But I kind of wish that we had a new cliche, which is die on every hill. Like, if someone's going to talk to you like you're a slave, or you should respect them when they're talking like a slave and you have to be slavish, decide not to fly that day and walk out. I know that sounds crazy, but I've done that before in other situations, not with flights, but it's just too much. It's too much. Like, again, if you're really irritated and you're going to fly off the handle, then that's a problem. But if you can do it with a sense of dispassion or something, keeping your head on ice, at least, even if your heart's on fire, I think we need to start a movement of die on every hill until they give up. It costs too much for them to keep trying, but I don't know. Maybe that's not going to catch on.
Part of the reason Twitter is so pathological, perhaps, and is such a snake pit of polarization is because it does encourage that kind of impulsive and immediate response to things that are perhaps of sufficient seriousness so that they should only be taken seriously.
Yeah, it encourages many things that I think are ultimately producing some consequential delusions for us individually and at scale. It provides a kind of an illusion of conversation because you'll tweet something at me, I'll tweet something at you, and we seem to be talking. But as you know, we're primarily talking in front of our respective audiences, which are different, which are largely different, right? So when I say something to you, it's my audience is at my back, and vice versa.
A bit, Sam.
Sure.
I want to turn our attention, if you don't mind, to some of the deeper issues that you and I have discussed. And I have a bunch of questions for you. So the first thing I want to do is clarify something. My recollection of particularly our last conversation, and it was one that I found clarified my understanding of your thought to a greater degree than our previous conversations we had, probably because I listened to you more, was that, and so correct me if I get this wrong, because I want to use this as a platform to ask you some other questions. My understanding after that conversation was that you were driven to search for an objective foundation for moral claims, primarily because you had become convinced of the existence of, for lack of a better term, of evil in the world, and were looking for solid ground to stand on in your attempts to both understand and combat the most malevolent proclivities. We could leave it at that. Now, is that a reasonable conclusion? Have I got that right?
Yeah, I think my motive will be pretty familiar to you. This came largely out of the collisions I was having with people after I wrote my first two books, The End of Faith and Letter to a Christian Nation, where I was noticing disproportionately on the left, specifically, I mean, we've come full circle now to this moment, in the news cycle, but mostly in response to my criticism of Islamic extremism and the kind of the urgency with which I was saying that the Islamic doctrines of martyrdom and jihad are sincerely believed by millions of people, and these beliefs have real consequences in the world, and they're not good ones, right? And we should talk about that honestly. What I was getting mostly from the left was, what struck me as pure masochistic delusion, but it was on its own side a very sophisticated philosophy of postmodernist truth claims about the relativity of everything, which in the minds of its adherents left us with no solid ground to stand on ever when making claims about right and wrong and good and evil. The point where it became, and this is something this is actually a scene I wrote verbatim in my third book, The Moral Landscape, which is where I laid out my argument on this topic. I was at the Salk Institute at a conference that had been organized. It was either in 2006 or 2007, I believe. And I had said something disparaging about the Taliban in my remarks about the relationship between moral values and our growing scientific understanding of the human mind and human well-being. And I said, something that I should have been uncontroversial in that context. And I'm at the Salk Institute, this preeminent scientific institution down in La Jolla, which is one of the nicest places on earth. With an auditorium filled with well-heeled people who appear to be enjoying their political freedom and their freedom of speech and freedom of everything. And I said something about we just know whatever remains to be discovered about the nature of morality and human value and human well-being. We know that the Taliban don't have it perfectly right. So if whatever the optimal way of living is, we know that the Taliban haven't found it, right? We know that forcing half the population to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them when they try to get out is not an optimal strategy for maximizing human well-being. And then a woman academic, and she actually happened to be, or was later a scientific advisor to President Obama for medical ethics, came up to me and said, "Well, that's just your opinion, right?" And so then this led me to realize just how far the rot had spread. That even here is someone who is a woman academic who's enjoying all the freedom of however hard won that can be found in Western society. Presumably, this is a person who would have responded to the Me Too movement and all its moral urgency with alacrity. he was still open-minded, at least in the context of talking to me, about the treatment of women and girls under the Taliban, right? And I detail our further conversation again verbatim in my book, because I was so astounded by the exchange that I turned on my heels literally in mid-sentence, walked straight back to my room and wrote down exactly what the two of us had said, because I just could not believe what had happened. So the moral confusion here is.
So as we get into our ethics class, it's interesting to notice that the woman he's talking about was a presidential advisor on medical ethics. Her philosophy on ethics is anything can be excused if you're motivated to excuse it. And she's advising the federal government on what should be done medically on a national level, what the policy should be. Maybe we should educate ourselves on this topic so that we can win some debates and say things in unignorable ways that bother people like that, because there's certainly a battle.
That you have many well-educated people who will make very fine-grained distinctions about moral norms in the context of living in 21st century America. They'll consider words to be violence, and the misgendering of people to be a profound microaggression. Halloween costumes that culturally appropriate, et cetera, are anathema. This is how finely calibrated their moral scruples are over here, in the quad of an American university. But you ask them to consider whether someone like Malala Yousafzai was badly treated by the Taliban, and they become tongue-tied, right? They will even say things like, "Well, who are we to criticize an ancient culture?" So that motivated me to say, all right, the smartest, most well-educated people in our society have become unmoored to any vision of objective moral values, right? They have, worse, they have become anchored to a belief that objectivity with respect to moral values is impossible, and certainly science will never have anything to say about it. And so they've ceded this ground to dogmatic religion, right? And someone like Stephen Jay Gould did this when he had this conception of the non-overlapping magisteria between religion and science, right? So science talks about facts and what is, but religion talks about what should be and the totality of human values. And I think that's never been a tenable way of dividing the pie. But it has this obvious defect that where people who lose their religious convictions are then left standing on apparently nothing when it comes time to say something like slavery is wrong. I mean, you literally have professors saying, "Well, I don't like slavery. I don't happen to like it. I wouldn't want a slave, but I can't really say it's wrong from the point of view of the universe, right? I mean, that's not what science does." And my point is that morality, and this is perhaps something you're going to want to disagree with, but in my view, morality has to relate to the suffering and well-being of conscious creatures. I mean, not even limiting it to humans, but just whatever can possibly suffer or be made happy in this universe is a possible theater of moral concern. And we know that conscious minds must be arising in some way in conformity to the laws of nature. I mean, so whatever is possible for conscious minds is a statement about, at bottom, a final scientific understanding of what minds are and what consciousness is and how those things are integrated with the physics of things. And so there have to be right answers to the question of how to navigate from the worst possible suffering for everyone to places on the moral landscape that are quite a bit better than that, where there's beauty and creativity and joy of a sort that we can only dimly imagine. And the question of how to do that and what that landscape looks like, it's a fact-based discussion about.
Okay, now we got into a statement we can discuss based on all the stuff we've been reading and the few things we're going to be reading soon. So we're going to force ourselves into a discussion. Get ready. All right. We know about his motivation. Now, Sam says, morality has to relate to well-being of conscious creatures. And then he says, conscious minds, those conscious creatures, those conscious minds must arise in some way through natural processes. Therefore, a scientific explanation of that origination would exist, and therefore a scientifically relevant, there's a relevant place for scientific discussion to settle ethical questions. Okay, so before we try to discuss it, let's just talk about the thought process here. First, he is not saying morality is absolutely reduced to nothing but the well-being of conscious creatures. He's not being sloppy in his language, and if he had wanted to say that, he would have, but he wasn't saying that. So he's not giving anybody any room to say, you're saying the absolute foundation is this. All he's saying is that morality has to relate to the well-being of conscious creatures, that it must play a role, right? He's not even claiming it's a foundational role. He could maybe think that or maybe not. All he's claiming, though, is that at minimum, it has something to do with the well-being of conscious creatures. In other words, if a person was completely indifferent to the well-being of conscious creatures, if their behavior led to nothing but the ill-being of all conscious creatures, there's no way that could be a moral thing to do. So there has to be a connection between the two. That's all he's claiming, right? We want to be careful about this, because what we don't want to do is imagine he's claiming something easier to attack and then go attack something that he didn't say. So that's the first thing he says. Then he has a connection between the fact that it's related to conscious creatures. He also asserts that conscious minds, they didn't come from magic. They arose through presumably Darwinian processes, material explanations, at least scientific understanding. There's something natural going on. It's not like he thinks conscious minds are supernatural in their origin. So now that he has those first 2 points that he's made, if you agree with those, let's see if the conclusions follow. He says, from those 2 points alone, science has something to say about ethical questions. And I don't think I misheard him when he said the scientific language can settle certain ethical questions. And what he's just said at the last minute, to rephrase that again, is that these things are facts. So murder is always wrong, could be true or false, but it's a fact. That's why it could be true or false, because it's a fact, and it's a fact that's amenable to enough empirical investigation, right? So if we're confused about whether or not murder is always wrong, all we have to do, he thinks, is go and continue studying the relevant scientific fields that can connect those sorts of actions to the well-being or the harm of conscious creatures. And that's completely a matter for science. And that's the nature of ethical statements. So we've read a lot of essays from subjectivist and objectivist positions, from, let's see, deontological positions. We read a utilitarian position, but we've read, I think, interestingly enough, was the essay that says the exact opposite of this, which is that it's not that kind of a truth, right? An ethical statement isn't the sort of thing that could be true or false if what you're talking about is the nature of good. So we've had all sorts of different positions that we've heard. Now we know his position. So just like a lot of the essays we just read, he comes out of the gate swinging and saying, here's where I'm standing on this big field of debate. This is the area that I'm marking off. So if we want to engage with what he's saying, we don't want to get that wrong. He was very clear. He didn't say absolutely the only thing that's ethically significant are conscious creatures. He didn't say anything like that. He just said it has to be relevant. And since it's relevant, and since it's a naturally emerging thing, it's a naturally evolving thing, whichever, it's something that science, if we study the right branches of science and we do it thoroughly enough, can help us to settle, because ultimately those ethical statements are facts. They're either true or false, but they're facts that could be shown to be true or false. So I'm going to ask, does anybody see anything wrong or weak, or that they would like to, just specifically about what he said and his syllogism there, right? Maybe I can write it in a way. Hold on a second. ethics has something to do. Oh, this won't put the indentations in there. That's unfortunate. Okay. So this won't have the indentations, but I'll say 1 dot and then 2 dot. I don't even think he said conscious minds are the result of natural processes alone, although I imagine that's what he thinks. But he says they are the result of natural processes. So therefore, science can help us settle ethical questions. All right, so I'm going to type that in there. All right, yeah, it didn't put the indentation. So let's say this is a basic version of a syllogism. I hope there's nothing unfair about the way I've briefly rephrased it. Ethics has something at least to do with conscious creatures. Conscious minds are the result of natural processes. Therefore, science can help us to settle ethical questions. It sounds like what he means is, or what he said was that science is all you would need to be able to settle ethical questions, provided you could do enough science and that you could have the relevant field and it wasn't beyond our knowing for whatever reason. But that the nature of the question is something that could be settled scientifically because the nature of the statement is like an empirical claim. So I'm curious, does anybody like or dislike, is there something that you think could be bolstered about this argument? Is there a weakness to it that jumps out at you? I'm going to force you to respond here. So I'll repeat it again, and maybe I can't see if people have their mics unmuted. So just start talking. Oh, there we go. Now I can see. Anyway, just start talking. So, so Sam, he was motivated because he found a presidential advisor in medical ethics who was saying that to condemn or to say it's wrong to shoot up schoolgirls in a Muslim majority country because of your faith is just a matter of your opinion. And he was horrified by that, shocked that any adult could say something like that. And so he was motivated to look for ways of showing that ethics is something objective. It's something solid that you can rely upon. It's not just a postmodern, wishy-washy mix of opinions where all you could look at is social psychology or something in order to try to figure out why we think it. And then he makes this argument. He says, look, I don't think that's true. I think, first of all, ethics obviously has something to do with conscious creatures and their well-being, right? The well-being of conscious creatures is strongly connected. He doesn't say it's the only thing that matters, but he says it has something to do with it. And he says conscious minds are the result of natural processes. However our minds got here, something like Darwinism can explain how they got here. It's a science, it's a part of the physical world that can be examined, investigated, formulas could be found, predictions could be made about various features of it because it's a scientifically amenable subject. And then 3, therefore, science can help us at least to settle ethical questions. But again, when he says that those questions are a matter of fact, I think what he's saying, I think maybe I misworded it. He's saying something maybe a little stronger there. Science is all that you would need if you could do good enough science to settle an ethical question. So I guess maybe the first question, if anybody wants to speak up, is, does anybody like the conclusion? Let's forget about the argument. Maybe you've got a better argument for it. Maybe you think his argument made a flaw, but you wish there was a better one. But do you like or dislike the conclusion? How about we'll make it a little stronger? Science is all you need to settle ethical questions, provided you have access to the right branch of science and you're not hindered in making progress in that branch of science for some reason.
I'm not a fan.
Not a fan. Okay. Now, if you're not a fan of the conclusion, do you have to accept the fact that the premises and the logical flow of the syllogism forces you to conclude it anyway? Sometimes we'll accept unwelcome conclusions to us if the argument is good enough. In other words, imagine yourself adopting this argument and saying to yourself, well, I think ethics has something to do with conscious creatures, and I also think that conscious minds are the result of natural processes. So obviously the sciences are the ways that we investigate natural processes. So maybe I don't think it's all you need, but I think it certainly can help.
Well, I'd have to see some examples that he has of how science can help us settle ethical questions.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's right. It becomes too subjective to me. You talk about ethics, right? He's talking about human rights. If you were alone on an island, none of that exists. Right?
Okay, good. So awesome response. So two things to say about that. One, science could have been invented yesterday, and we might have not done any investigations into the relevant fields to try to settle ethical questions. But his argument should be able to convince us that that's what we should do, right? So that would be without any examples. If the argument's good enough, it shouldn't need examples. However, obviously, if you're not sure if the argument's good enough or not, but we've been doing science for a long time and we've got lots of ethical conversations going for a long time, there should be some examples. So obviously that's a legitimate bit of evidence to look for there if you're trying to figure out if the argument works. The second thing is, well, let's put on our Sam Harris hat here and say, well, the first thing we can say is obviously science is relevant. I mean, part of ethics is figuring out what the likely consequences are of a certain action, particularly the consequences on conscious creatures. So let's see. If I, ooh, that would be a really fun one. Let's say I think it's ethical to, let's do something else. Let's say I think it's ethical to drive my car as recklessly as I want because it's fun for me and it gives me a lot of pleasure, and that's good for my conscious mind. And so I think it's a good thing to just do whatever I want with my car because it's a lot of fun and I haven't died yet. Somebody else could say, well, here's a bunch of scientific evidence and data collection on the statistics and the likelihood that you're going to kill somebody, damage property. We know that that hurts other people's consciousness. You could have like an infinite negative impact on somebody by killing their loved one, or something like that, right? So obviously you wouldn't say I have to settle that rationally without any empirical inquiry, and I think it would be fair enough to say that stuff like that is science. It's not like we're putting the claim under a microscope or something, but we're going and collecting data and looking for real world consequences for things and measuring stuff and saying, well, it might seem like you're going to live forever and you'll never crash because you're such a good driver, but look at all the statistics, and we can collect all that data and say, that's a way for us to settle this ethical question of whether or not it's good to do what you feel like doing behind the wheel. So that would be Sam saying it's relevant, like it can help, but I'm not sure that's good enough to say it's all you would need.
Sure, I would say in that scenario that makes sense.
You would say what?
I would say in that scenario it would.
Okay.
That would make sense.
Okay, good, but we don't like the conclusions. So I keep switching the conclusion. The conclusion is that science is relevant, which is actually pretty easy to demonstrate. But if the conclusion is no, ethical statements are statements of fact, they can be settled with science alone, that's a harder thing to prove. And I'm not sure that even that example is settling things with science alone. Like, what if somebody brought up the question, well, why should you care about the well-being of others? Could you find a scientific reason for saying you should care about other people's well-being? Hey, how can you even prove that they have conscious minds at all? You know your conscious mind, so you're sacrificing all this great pleasure of driving recklessly for your conscious mind. Those other minds could just be zombies and robots, and you don't even have any evidence of that. So somebody might say, how can you argue that you should care at all? And I'm not sure you could use science to get there. So that might be a weak attack, but it might be a kind of an attack because it's certainly a hard. Well, we'll keep listening and see if he is sticking to the hard conclusion or the softer one. I think nobody would disagree with the softer one, probably upon reflection, at least, that science has something to say. I mean, we're talking about real world actions, and if we're not sure about what's going to happen, then we can go and do science on it. But that's a soft conclusion. That. Who are you pushing back against there? Everybody agrees with that. Or you can imagine most everybody would. In philosophy, somebody's going to disagree with anything. But the harder one would be to say, no, these ethical statements, they reduce to just scientific facts, and that's all you need is science. And I'm not sure he's shown that yet. Does anybody else have a question about this argument? I mean, if you don't like the conclusion, it's not fair to say that this is his only argument. He was just talking off the cuff to say generally an outline of where he was going, but it had the full syllogism in there. So if we want to just examine this and say, well, what might we expect him to bolster and strengthen because there's a weakness here in this argument? What jumps out at us? So I'll ramble a little bit and please jump in. So the ethics. I'm sorry, go ahead.
It could possibly be the data shows doing certain studies that living a life of reciprocity is going to have a good effect on you and your family and you and your community versus just living selfishly. You're only looking out for yourself, say, like driving the car erratically and not having any concern for your community, right? It's, well, that effect, you're not only affecting yourself, you're affecting your family. Let's say now that you don't have a job, you're in jail, and now your kids are kicked out of their home, and now, right, it has these negative effects that continue on.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I'm with you. I think we can use consequences and we can use scientific conversation to help in ethical conversations. I think there's a large number of philosophers in various camps who would disagree with the second premise. The first one seems, you can disagree with it. Obviously, you can disagree with anything in philosophy. You can find a way. But
would it be what are natural processes?
Yeah, the idea that conscious minds reduced to something that is investigatable by science is clearly not even the majority view of philosophical camps. Essentially, you know, I mean, so first of all, in order to do a science, you have to banish all consideration of the subject. You're trying to objectify. You're trying to become disconnected, dispassionate, and look at it sort of through a Cartesian God's eye from outside the universe, and you're just measuring things. But to bring in conscious minds is to bring in the very thing that you're not allowed to consider within science in the first place. And we're going to see in our philosophy of mind course, which we're going to be doing before we even do the full ethics course. This is just the intro part. We're going to be seeing lots and lots of arguments and lots of approaches in science to trying to make sense of the mind and sort of the walls that they're up against. In fact, the end of the anthology ends with some real challenges to materialism through the study of the mind. So from a philosophical perspective, that's not a majority view. You know, I don't know what the fat is in universities. Who cares right now? But it's certainly not a majority view in the conversation of philosophy. That doesn't matter. We don't judge based off of majority views, but certainly it's questionable is all I'm saying. But then moving from 2 to 3 doesn't seem obvious to me either. So if we leave 1 alone for a moment, because we're not here just to show off that we're clever enough to argue with things that don't seem easy to argue against, but moving from 2 to 3, if he must be saying conscious minds are only the result of natural processes, and by natural, he must mean things that are amenable to investigation. So he doesn't believe, it seems, I know that he does believe in a subjective consciousness, but I don't see how he can believe that with this argument. There's 2 books being kept. There's a conflict here, I think. I might be wrong. We're going to listen really carefully because he's no dummy. So don't let that be some sort of judgment. I have no idea what he thinks about that right now. We're going to hear him talk about it in a moment. But if conscious minds are the result of natural processes, maybe he has an emergence view that you can have some real magic come out of just material processes. He doesn't say material, he says natural, which is very different. But if you're saying natural, you might be opening it up to more than material. And I'm not sure the scientific goes into things that are beyond the material in that way, like in exactly the way I was talking about as far as considering the subjective. So, for instance, a panpsychist perspective that says, well, everything's nature, it's all natural, it's not material, it's all natural, but nature has consciousness as part of the quality of it on rudimentary levels and on sophisticated levels in our minds. That's bringing in that subjective and infusing it in all of nature. That's fine if that's why you want to use natural processes. But I think it throws a monkey wrench in the idea that science is the appropriate language for investigating all natural occurrences, because that's, again, a subjective thing. It's not, again, by subjective, I don't mean relativistic or not really solid. It's more solid in a lot of ways. It might be fundamental, but science isn't the appropriate language for that. So I'm not sure I see exactly how that follows. Now, I'm afraid if we keep trying to attack this one brief version of it, that we're not going to be fair to what he actually thinks. So let's let him speak for himself, because he's not stupid, and I don't want to cartoonify what he's saying here. But that was a worthwhile pause. So
science at every level that could be relevant to the conscious states of conscious mind. So it's a statement, it's a discussion about genetics and psychology of a sort that we can only dimly imagine. And the question of how to do that and what that landscape looks like, it's a fact-based discussion about science at every level that could be relevant to the conscious states of conscious mind. So it's a statement, it's a discussion about genetics and psychology and neurobiology and sociology and economics and sciences as yet uninvented.
Okay, so that is definitely what he was saying then. I was afraid I was going to be unfair. So in Sam Harris's view, he imagines, he believes, he affirms or asserts that we don't know everything about the conscious mind, but when we do, if we ever get there, we will get there through the advancement of all the relevant sciences. He doesn't think that if we advance science for 10,000 years or 10 million years unbroken, we keep advancing in genetics and psychology, as he said, and neuroscience and all of these different fields, we're eventually going to know everything we have to know about consciousness to be at least able to settle all ethical questions. He does think that's the case. When I was talking about the fact that seems very dubious to me, and we're going to get into the philosophy of mind, and we're going to see some real reasons why I that's not my intuition. First of all, psychology is a really, really amazing subject. It's a really amazing branch of the humanities and the sciences, because it has one foot in science and one foot in mythology. I mean, psychology is sometimes it's about recording carefully what's been said to you as a clinical psychologist and publishing a study about behaviors and actions and things people say and how they respond to ink blotches. Sometimes it's about giving 10,000 people the same survey with a whole bunch of questions and then doing a lot of mathematical analysis. Sometimes it's about rats or children or bunnies in a lab and you control the situation. Very, very sciencey. Sometimes it's about interpreting dreams. I know it's called the psychology and people it's called psychology and people think of it as a science, but that is not science. It's valuable, it's relevant, it's completely legitimate in my perspective, and obviously I think it's super valuable. I don't see that as a science. I think that there's other academic intellectual pursuits that don't get to be called science or shouldn't be called science that are super meaningful and very, very valuable. I don't see how talking to a subject about their subjective experience of the story they revealed to their own mind and what it might mean in order to tell them something could possibly be connected to anything you can measure. You can measure the way they talk about it, right? You can absolutely do that. And in psychology, there are people doing that in a scientific kind of a way. But there's art and there's narrative and there's intuition and the narrative itself is necessary to the dream if it's telling you anything, because it can only talk in that language. It's telling you a story. It's saying there's a thing blocking you from getting to a destination, or this is the situation you're in as a character. That language doesn't reduce to science, I don't think. That's just one of the fields to make the point. So at least we weren't being unfair to him. And, he could be right about this. And we haven't done the philosophy of mind yet, but the qualia question, there's all sorts of reasons why I think it's very dubious to assert that science is going to be able to wrap itself around the proper formulas for understanding consciousness. But he does think that that's the case. So we weren't being unfair to him. He does think that, look, we don't have it now. Let's keep pushing all those sciences forward. And of course, who could disagree with that? Let's keep doing it. It's going to have a lot to tell us for sure. It's not like we're saying, let's throw the sciences out. Super, super valuable. I'm not sure they're valuable enough that you could say they're all you need to settle any question related to consciousness, which he might give an argument for, but so far he hasn't. So far, that's a gap of something that I think needs to be added, and he might do that in a minute. So we'll get back to it.
Respect to causality in this place, and so that's my argument that we need a spirit of consilience across the domain of facts and values, and so there's more to say there, but I'll stop.
Okay. Well, so I'm gonna pick up a couple of themes there. So one of the things that you pointed to was the incoherence manifested by this woman and like people in relationship to micro narratives and macro narratives. So you said that it was in your opinion, that she or the people who she might represent would be perfectly willing to be upset about some relatively minor issue that might arise on a university campus, like the wearing of inappropriate Halloween costumes, but are incoherent in relationship to making broader scale moral claims. Now, one of the claims of the postmodernists, this was put forward most particularly by, who was it now, who said that there were no meta-narratives. The postmodernism is fundamentally disallowance of the idea that any uniting meta-narratives are possible. I'll remember his name momentarily.
It could be Derrida or Foucault or...
No, it's not. He's the guy who generated simulation theory, another Frenchman.
No, Lacan? Or
No.
Baudrillard? It's a rogues gallery.
Baudrillard. It's Baudrillard.
It's a rogues gallery.
Yeah, it's Baudrillard. Yeah. Okay, so here's the problem with that. Well, the problem with that in part is that there's no united action and perception at any level without a uniting narrative. So, for example, if I pick up a glass to move a cup from the table to my lips, I have to organize all those extraordinarily complex actions, right, which cascade up from the molecular level through the musculature of my body. I have to organize that into something that's coherent and unified in order to bring about any action whatsoever. And what that implies is that there's a hierarchy of uniting structure. And what the postmodernists do is arbitrarily make that halt at a certain level. It's like, so you're allowed a uniting narrative or structure up to a certain level, but beyond that, you're not allowed it at all. And that's the point at which the meta-narrative emerges, and those are now forbidden. And I don't understand that, because I think that it's a distinction between a narrative and a meta-narrative it's an arbitrary distinction, and you can't attend or act without a uniting narrative. So now you seem to be pointing to something like that. So let me walk through your argument. You pointed to the Taliban.
I'll add one other, which I think is a simpler defeater, which is that the claim is that there can be no universal values, right? And a universal truth claim with respect to right and wrong and good and evil. And yet they tacitly make the universal claim that tolerance of this ethical diversity is better than intolerance, right? So the demand is we need to find some space in our minds to tolerate the difference of opinion offered by the Taliban or Hamas or some other group of that sort. But that doesn't make any sense. That's an appeal to tolerance, one that the Taliban and Hamas don't share, right? So we're tolerating their intolerance. But it's also the tacit claim that tolerance is better. Tolerance on our own side is better.
Tolerance is the uniting narrative.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, you see the same thing with the postmodern.
That's a pretty good argument, huh? we're trying to pick apart Sam's early argument, but now he comes out swinging. That was pretty good, right? So if the postmodernists are correct that you have no right to judge this other culture and their different values, because there are no ultimate values of what's right and wrong, and this is really scary because there are people doing this right now. That's annoying, right? We're going to try to find a way to defeat that. Well, one of the ways to defeat it, and this is not being advised by me, but you see it on Twitter, is to say, oh, okay, I'll just swallow that whole. Any nasty, horrible, racially supreme theory, I can have mine too. So I don't have to say this other culture is bad because they're promoting ideas that lead people to think they're going to go to heaven for shooting schoolgirls on their way to school. I can say, screw the sand monkeys. I want them all dead. I'm not saying that, by the way, right? But somebody could respond if they wanted to be a white supremacist or anything. They could say, well, that's how dare you judge my view? My view is that we should be the ones trying to eradicate and perform genocide against everybody else. And if you've got a totalitarian system, I'm not judging it for being totalitarian. I'm going to agree with you. You've left me no room for saying I can say it's wrong for its own, for reasons why it's wrong. So all you've reduced everything to is a power game. Well, I can play a power game then. And there's lots of people doing this, and it's quite worrying, actually. So I want to be clear, I'm not advocating it, not because I'm worried people will think I'm advocating it in the sense of for my own reputation, but because I don't want to advocate it. I don't want to promote it, but you see it out there, and it's a natural psychological and subconscious response, even though it's also explicit with some people where they know they're doing it. But it's a natural response when people are saying you're not allowed to have opinions, but other people who want you dead are allowed to have their opinions, because who are you to judge their opinions? Instead of figuring out philosophically why they're wrong, and this is what Sam is motivated to do. He wants to say, you postmodernists are wrong. I can show that ethics is a legitimate subject that we can talk about and care about, and I don't have to just be relativistic about it all. But if you don't want to do that intellectual work, or if you feel like you just maybe have a lot of resentment for their bullying and their nastiness, it's very easy to imagine that we're on the precipice of radical leftists bringing into the world a new Nazi movement. I mean, in 2015, they saw it everywhere, even though it didn't exist. But now, after 4 years of them abusing everybody and calling them racist and evil, I mean, I guess at some point, some people, and I think this is wrong, I think it's what we want to avoid doing. But at some point, some people say, well, if I'm getting the punishment anyway, I may as well commit the crime. Now, I don't think people are inclined to do that unless some part of them really wants to commit the crime. But all of us have a germ of resentment and a desire for that type of a thing. I mean, it's like Peterson says, Nazis were human beings and you're one of them. You're a human being too. So it's something that can appeal to human beings. And it's not like the 2% worst people in Germany were Nazis. It's that people were going along with this because it was satisfying psychologically for them in the context that they were in. So, I really enjoy this conversation between Peterson and Harris because they have very different perspectives on some things. But what we don't want is to end up in a world where all you have is a voice for the radical left and the obviously therefore respondent emergent voice of the radical right, which I do think, I mean, I've seen too much of it now on Twitter to think that it's just trolls at this point. It seems to me pretty obvious that inevitable pushback is happening. And, that might be part of the motivation. If you're a radical and you're looking to watch the world burn, it might not be displeasing to you to see radicals on the opposite side emerging, because that justifies your radical position. So everybody already knows this, but it's very worrying, and it seems pretty obvious where the trend is going. And we need a moderate presidential candidate like Trump to pull everybody back to the middle. All right, we'll stop. We won't go into politics, but let's continue.
Insistence, this is particularly true of people like Foucault, that nothing rules but power, right? Because Foucault saw power making itself manifest everywhere. And the fundamental postmodernist claim is that there's no uniting meta-narratives, but that didn't stop the postmodernists for a second in making the claim that you could find power relations underlying every single form of human action and social interaction. So, but this this uniting narrative, see, you point to it in a way that I think that points out to me a very fundamental element of agreement between the positions that you and I have taken, even though we've had so much apparent disagreement. You point to the Taliban and you say, at minimum, we can say with some degree of certainty that what the Taliban are doing is not optimal. Okay, and you said that's a claim that's so weak in a way that it should just be self-evident, right? You know what I mean by weak? It's like, isn't that obvious? Well, I started in my investigations at a more extreme point, I would say. I looked at the camp guard in Auschwitz who enjoyed his work and thought, I don't know what good is, but at minimum, it's the opposite of whatever the hell that is. And so that was a starting point for me. And it seems to me that partly what you're doing is that you put your foot firmly on the head of evil and say, well, this is a starting point. And even though we can't define good, we can define it as the opposite of whatever this is. And so does that seem like a reasonable point of agreement between us?
Yeah.
As far as you're concerned.
Yeah, although I think this is perhaps a different topic, but it certainly adjacent to what you just said. I think there's some ethical paradoxes here which would be interesting to consider, because I think most of human evil of the sort that you and I are now describing doesn't require the presence of actually evil people, right? I think there are evil people. I think there are true psychopaths and sadists for whom it is true to say that if evil means anything, it should be applied to their conscious states and their psychology. But so much of what we consider to be evil, and so much of what produces needless human misery, is the result of otherwise normal people psychologically behaving terribly because they believe fairly crazy and unsupportable things about what reality is and how they should live within it. So I would by no means ever want to suggest, in fact I'm at pains to say otherwise whenever I can remember to, that all jihadists or even most jihadists or all Nazis or even most Nazis were psychopaths, right? I mean, the horror of these belief systems is not that they act like bug lights for the world's psychopaths, and you attract a lot of people who would be doing terrible things anyway, and they just happen to start doing it in this new context, let's say under the Islamic State. No, you certain ideologies attract totally normal people who would otherwise be totally recognizable to us psychologically and socially as good, normal people, but for the fact that they got convinced that, of whatever the relevant dogma is, in the case of, yeah.
Okay. Well, so I would say that's another point of agreement. It seems to me that the pathological, the systems that produce rapid movement towards social and psychological pathology both facilitate psychopathic behavior and attract the psychopaths. I would say it's both of those. You can have both of those operating at the same time, right? And so then what we have are we have systems of ideas working in the background, and those systems of ideas draw people into their orbit and motivate them to do things that under the influence of other systems of ideas they might not be inclined to do. Seem reasonable?
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, I would just note, and I mean, you might want to leave this aside, but your description of a guard at Auschwitz who enjoys his work, I think it's tempting to imagine that guard is incapable of all the ordinary forms of happiness and life satisfaction that we would recognize in ourselves because of what he is spending his time doing. And I would say that's obviously not the case. I mean, so there can be virtues expressed toward evil ends. I mean, just imagine, just unpack the meaning of that phrase, the guard at Auschwitz who enjoys his work, right? So like there's the do you know the I think it's just called the Auschwitz album. Did you ever see these photographs that were taken? They were found in an
Yes.
attic. I mean, it's one of the most amazing documents.
Nostalgia for Auschwitz. Yes, that's for sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Well,
yeah.
and I think your insistence that we can't merely write off that pathological behavior as a manifestation of a kind of human psychopathy is
Right.
extraordinarily important, right? Because we have to contend with the fact that these systems of ideas are capable of, I think, possessing is the best metaphor, and that's something I want to get into with you, that those systems of ideas are capable of possessing people who are in no way indistinguishable from normal people, and sometimes not indistinguishable from people with all sorts of laudatory traits.
I think you
Right?
mean
Okay.
not distinguishable. You said
Not
indistinguishable.
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, not just yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but
all
I
right,
would
so
just
part
to
of
add
the
one.
reason-
Sorry to keep derailing you, Jordan, but I would just add
Yeah.
one more piece here.
No,
Is
no.
that one thing this suggests is that mental pleasure, though it is often taken as a sign of the kind of moral rightness of our current preoccupation, isn't such a sign. I mean, you can, there's such a thing as pathological ecstasy, right? You can feel bliss.
Sure. Well, that's
and rapture.
sadism. Sadism is a great example of that.
Yeah, and so I would just say that so you can imagine the suicide bomber before he detonates his bomb, if like many of them, he's doing that with the sincere expectation that in the next moment he will be in paradise.
Okay, I think we covered the two parts that I most wanted to cover that were relevant to the course and the material that we've been talking about. That's a super interesting video, and I don't want to stop it, but I should have started it about 30 minutes in, and we've already gone an hour and a half. So, thoughts. I know we didn't get to finish the discussion, but Mark, thoughts on Sam Harris, thoughts on the conversation, thoughts on Peterson, thoughts on your poor father of a young child and you fell asleep while we were doing this. Sweet dreams. Savad, I know it's really interesting and we could keep watching it, but any thoughts on the general the relationship between Peterson and Harris as it's evolved? I really liked their first conversation. I know a lot of people thought it got bogged down, but it was really interesting. How about we just focus on Sam's desire is, it seems from him, we're not putting words in his mouth, is to ground ethics in something factual and scientific is how he gets there. Peterson, of course, has a very different perspective, which is that it is outside that realm, but they both agree that it's of ultimate significance, that it's something that we don't want the postmodernists and the relativists to just sort of wash away and act like we're all going to be fine. So they're agreed in their motivations. Now, Peterson is trying to point out to Sam, and he's been trying to do this more in their earlier conversations. Here, he's a little bit more trying to nail it down and hear exactly what Sam is saying. But when Peterson is interjecting, he's trying to demonstrate or to put forward a demonstration which might be disproved. He's testing whether or not Sam is operating under what Peterson would call like a grand narrative, something narrative, again, something characterologically based, something that's not factual, that motivates all of this. Every time he tries to do that, Sam brings it back to simple, straightforward points that he can demonstrate. So it's not that he's denying any of that. He's just not affirming it. And what he's saying instead is, look, we don't need that to know enough. We can know enough to know that this is wrong and this is right, and the postmodernism is wrong, and here's a good argument for it. We don't need to actually have, I think in Sam's view, a grand narrative type of thing would be claiming stuff you don't actually know. He wants to know things in a really solid scientific kind of a way if he can. Of course, he's not like Spock or anything. He does meditation and all sorts of other things. But as far as knowledge goes, he wants it to be well grounded and he wants it to be solid. And I think it's very similar to the conversation that we'll eventually have again, but that we had once between Dr. Tartaglia and myself. We'll have it again, but it's that existentialist versus analytical impulse to say, yeah, let's go into this crazy realm of nightmares and dream characters and recognize how fundamentally important it is. I mean, Peterson's not talking about that right now, but that's the direction he wants to go. Is what if scriptural stories could tell us about who we are in a way that nothing else could, or what if there's a fundamental reality to Jungian archetypes, and those are not things that you're going to measure, that you're going to point to, that have a length, breadth, and width that you're going to have a science for. Sam Harris very much wants to go in the opposite direction, but both of them are trying to, get to a point where we feel confident about making ethical statements, and where we don't let the postmodernists tell us there's no meaning and there's no truth and anything goes, because they both see that as a major danger. Was this enjoyable? I could have edited it better, but
Yeah, it was enjoyable. Sam Harris seems to be in a better place, as Jordan Peterson mentioned early on.
It's nice to see him doing well. Yeah, I agree. When Peterson had that really horrible physical illness and stuff, and he came back from it, that was quite a relief. And I'm not trying to make a joke. I love Sam Harris. I think he's a fantastic individual, but that man has suffered from the disease of TDS worse than any thinking person. And it's nice to see him doing well, and hearing his good arguments. I mean, one of the things that happens with Twitter, and one of the things we're trying to do with keeping the group small and focusing on what people are saying and understanding the rules of charity and conversation, is demonstrate that there's a better way to talk. And Twitter Spaces, it's all about, I am a follower of Sam, I hate Sam, and it's like everybody just has to give an upvote or a downvote to every other person, rather than being a person and seeing people as people, and realizing that they can have an awful lot that can challenge you, that can have truth that you were not likely to see because they're coming from a perspective. One of the things people think about debate is that the point is to have a winner and a loser, or to try to convert somebody. And they say, well, this philosophy stuff, like I said earlier, what if we had good arguments against the postmodernists? And somebody could say, arguments aren't going to matter because they don't care about arguments, and that doesn't really change things. It's like, yeah, of course. Obviously, most people don't think what they think for reasons, and therefore reasons don't persuade them out of it. But it's also one of the things that matters. There's also the moment where the person has to give a defense of their view, and there's a huge crowd of people who are thinking, well, maybe that'll win. And if we understand philosophy and we can give a counter argument to that, then it's not about converting that one person, but it's about pushing the conversation forward and demonstrating what is wrong with certain views as best we can. And we can't do that well unless we're open to the idea that our views could stand some revision. And maybe there's a grain of truth in the postmodernist view. Maybe there's a grain of truth in the thing we hate the most that needs to be shouted at us, so that we can learn how to adjust to it and make a defense for it, and sophisticate either the way we talk about what we think, but more often and more valuably, what we're actually thinking. And so there's all this benefit from engaging with people you don't agree with. I know this is a different topic, but I'm going to end it on this, because I think it goes to part of the reason why we're all dedicated to coming and doing these things, is that we can read these essays and say, look, the main thing is, let me understand what this guy's saying and see if he has a point or not. And with Twitter Spaces, which I'm not picking on them, but with most of what happens on Twitter, for sure, outside of Spaces, it's all just, I vote yes, I vote no, we're on this guy's team, we're against it. It's like the people praising someone or condemning them, neither of them even give a damn what the person's actually saying. It's all sort of a show. And life doesn't have to be that cartoonish for us. We can I always want to get a button that just says get a life. We can get a life. We can actually say, you know, I don't have the answers here, but these things obviously matter. Let's dive into all of the best defenses of different views and see how we emerge at the end. And it's worthwhile. And it might even be the basis of something even more worthwhile, something like Socrates was saying, something like love, something like that which is really meaningful. But also, it's beneficial for sharpening and reshaping what it is we think. So on that note, we're going to go into the after conversation. We're probably going to talk about Sam and Jordan a lot more, and maybe even watch a little bit more of the video. But I think that was fun, and I love the conversation we're having. I think there's 3 more essays to cover, so we'll definitely finish it, I imagine, in next week. We do this class on Intro to Intro of Ethics, which is part of the Philosophy 101. We do it Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, so we will probably finish this section next week, and then we'll move on to the problem of induction, or one of the other areas of the Philosophy 101 course. So on that, we'll end the stream, and we'll go